when I was planning this concert, I wanted very much to build it around Mahler's Fourth Symphony, and just happened to be looking down a list of composers to sort of get an idea of what else might be available, and saw that Liszt had been born in 1811. And I thought, well, let's see, he was born 1811, Mahler died 1911. I thought, okay, is there another prominent composer who had a date, birth, death date, 1811, 1911, that we could fit in here that would make the mix just right? And it turned out that Bernard Herrmann, one of my big heroes, was born in 1911. So we're celebrating three very different centenaries this concert: the 200th anniversary of Liszt's birth, the 100th anniversary of Bernard Herrmann's birth, and the 100th anniversary of Mahler's death. The Liszt piece is admittedly a potboiler. Even if you don't think you know it by its name, Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, I promise you, if you've ever gone near any of the classic Bugs Bunny cartoons, you know this piece. It's a great deal of fun to play. When we had our first read-through a couple of weeks ago, the orchestra was uniformly smiling at the opportunity to play. And who couldn't get off on playing that? The Herrmann piece is a suite that he himself derived from the music that he wrote for Hitchcock's Vertigo. Bernard Herrmann had this uncanny knack, irrespective of the film, irrespective of the director, for matching the emotional tenor of the movie, the voices of the actors and actresses, and sometimes the pure visual look of a film in his music. It was brought to light that when Hitchcock told him that Psycho was going to be a black and white film, then Herrmann said, well, in that case, I will write you a black and white score. And that's why the score to Psycho is just strings. Herrmann felt that the black, white, gray look would be best matched by an orchestra of like instruments. And so he only used string instruments and wrote what I think is arguably the greatest film score of all. Vertigo has a bunch of visual cues in it. Hitchcock wanted the audience to feel in some ways pulled in one way and pulled in another way, sometimes one at a time, sometimes simultaneously. And the most famous shot in Vertigo was something that Hitchcock and his director of photography devised, where there's a famous scene where Jimmy Stewart is running up a somewhat spiral staircase to save Kim Novak from jumping to her doom. And every time he looks down, the staircase starts doing something very peculiar, and you can't quite put your finger on it, but it really makes your stomach kind of turn a flip-flop. It's one of the most disconcerting shots I can think of in any film ever made. And just to kind of mirror that sense of push-pull, Vertigo starts with contrary motion. It starts with the upper voices going, and underneath it, the slightly lower voices are doing something in exactly the opposite direction. So when you put them together, there's this sense of the orchestra going, of sort of squeezing you, pushing you, pulling you, in a way that results in great aural discomfort, which I love. So from the very word go, that's the very opening music of the film, Herrmann has set us up for something very, very disquieting, disconcerting, maybe even physically uncomfortable. And then he just adds these two descending melodic ideas. And then a little later on in the overture, he introduces this painfully yearning romantic idea, which comes back later several times in the film as the romance, or I should say romances, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, see the film, between Jimmy Stewart and Kim Novak. But this very, very powerful very, very beautiful, and very self-consciously modeled, Hermann readily admitted the point, on Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, another great story about fated love. The symphonies of Gustav Mahler are among the most personal ever conceived by any of the great composers. Even from his first symphony, he made use of some songs that he had already written for voice and orchestra, songs of a wayfarer, which he wrote in the wake of an unsuccessful love affair. So he was already projecting a lot of himself, a lot of the lost love aspects of his life into his first symphony. When he wrote his second symphony, the Resurrection Symphony, there were programmatic references to the first symphony. When he wrote his third, which is, I believe, the longest in terms of pure elapsed time, there was going to be yet one more movement. The third was going to be another movement long. It was going to be 7 movements, not just the 6 that we know it by today. But I guess even Mahler figured that enough was enough, and so what was going to be the finale of the third became the finale of the fourth. And then when he wrote the fourth, there's this one little bit in the first movement where the trumpet suddenly intones rather ominously. And when he began the Fifth Symphony, it opens with one lone trumpet heralding this funeral march. So it's like every Mahler work sort of begat the next one, or had something to do with the creation, with the creative impulse that sparked the next symphony in the chain. A really very personal, very tightly knit body of work. For all that Mahler was death-obsessed, morbid, once said apropos the Sixth Symphony that it was the affirmation of life being just a big colossal joke. The Fourth Symphony is, in spite of a few dark elements that I just don't think he could have avoided if he tried, the happiest, the most lighthearted of the 9 symphonies, the 9 completed symphonies that we have from his pen. In fact, the last movement is rather like a child's view of heaven. Now, having said that, in this child's view of heaven, you can pretty much get any roasted animal you want, so it's not quite heaven for the animals, but it is heaven for the children. But I can think of no Mahler symphony that opens as sort of fairy tale-like and then goes into this absolutely beautiful tune, very like a folk tune. And from there leads us on this journey that suddenly gets to a great point of exaltation, as if he's maybe a little afraid of his own power. It then turns to a moment of alarm with the previously cited funeral march bit, and then he ends in a blaze of G major glory. The second movement has an unusual feature in that the concertmaster, the premier violinist of the orchestra, plays a lengthy solo in this movement on a deliberately mistuned violin, something that's called scordatura in classical music. Probably the most famous example of it in an orchestral work is the violin solo in the Saint-Saëns' Danse Macabre, where Saint-Saëns has a picture of a midnight jamboree at the graveyard, and normally the violin is tuned so that when the country western fiddler tunes up, it's... but in this case, Saint-Saëns directs that the top string E be tuned down to an E flat, so that when you play the top 2 strings together, you get this ear-splitting tritone, an interval that was called for years the devil in music, so that when Death finally comes and starts tuning up his violin, we get... etc. Well, Mahler does Saint-Saëns one better. He wants all 4 strings mistuned. So instead of this, he wants the entire violin tuned up a whole step. And so the violinist takes this macabre little solo throughout the movement, which Mahler once referred to as "death plays on." And because the violin is now stretched tighter, the strings have more tension, the sound is a little more grating, and it gives the sound of a fiddle, which is exactly what Mahler said he wanted. It has to sound like a fiddle player rather than a violinist. But that's about as morbid as the work gets. The third movement is an absolutely gorgeous reverie, predominantly quiet. Then there's an explosion toward the end that heralds in the key of E major, which is the key in which the symphony will eventually end. And then we get this finale, a setting of one of the song texts from Des Knaben Wunderhorn, a volume of traditional German poetry. And the Philharmonic is going to be joined by a very dear friend and colleague, Natalie Lurch, singing the soprano solo in this heavenly, except for the animals, finale.